Hello again. The last few weeks have been very difficult weeks for the Church of England. A man called John Smythe was a terribly sadistic, charismatic man who during his life beat at least 100, probably 200 or 300 boys and young men, and beat them very harshly, not just sort of a slap or six of the best, or which in the past was something which happened, but he actually beat these boys until they had blood running down their legs and they had to have nappies put on, and they were terrible, and he was a terrible man. He died about 7 or 8 years ago. But the awful suffering which he inflicted on these boys resulted in many of them having terrible problems in their life. And some managed to survive these beatings, but many did not, and it destroyed their lives. It made them very different people from the people which they could have become. One or two even committed suicide, and it would have affected not just them, but their families and their friends and all the people they came in contact with. It was a terrible experience for them, and we need to have great sympathy because their suffering continues. And a report just came out about the way in which the Church of England had failed to help these young men. They had known about it, different people in the hierarchy of the Church of England, and had known about the terrible suffering that these young men were going through, and nothing was done. Or they did something, they told the police, but did not follow up to see that action was being taken to stop this barbaric man doing his awful punishment, the beatings of these young boys, for nothing at all. It was just part of some crazy theological way of thinking that suffering somehow was a form of redemption, and that if you suffered enough, it was somehow making you right with God. Absolute rubbish. And the result was that these hundreds of young men suffered terribly. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury resigned about it because he realised that the Church of England had failed these young men most terribly. They had not done enough. They knew about it, and they had failed to make sure that it was stopped, and it did not happen. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury resigned, and it is hoped that other people within the hierarchy of the Church of England who failed to make sure that this was stopped, that they too will resign. And of course, it will be a very difficult time for them and for their families. Now, where should our sympathy lie? Of course, we are sorry for the people who are going through a very difficult time because they failed to act, and they are now having to suffer because they failed to act. But surely, much more important is that we remember all those people whose lives have been destroyed by this evil man. Of course, we recognise that we have to feel compassion for everybody, and perhaps I don't know the answer, and I don't suppose you know the answer. We need to, most especially at this time, have terrible sympathy and see what can be done for these people who went through this horrendous suffering, and recompense needs to be made to them, and they don't need to have to go through any more years when nothing is done. So yes, we feel terrible, terrible sympathy for them. Yes, we also feel sympathy for the people who are now having to pay the price of their failure to act and their families. So I suppose we just have to say that we have to be willing to recognise the suffering of everybody in life. There's a story about a young man who was visiting some friends of his, and a very precious vase was knocked off a bookshelf, and this young man managed to dive and capture this very valuable vase before it hit the ground, but in doing so he broke his arm. Now, what was worse? Should the vase have been allowed to break and him not break his arm, or was it worth him breaking his arm so that the vase was saved? It is just that it is very difficult when we have to have compassion for all people, and of course it is impossible to measure the suffering which people are going through. So let's just try to show our compassion and be compassionate for all those who have had to suffer, and let us do the best to alleviate suffering and make sure that as far as in our power we don't allow suffering to happen. So, not a very decisive talk, I'm afraid, and I would be very grateful for your views about what I'm saying. But first of all, do see what we can do for those terrible, suffering young people, those men. Some of them have died now. It happened in the 1980s, 90s, 2000. It should have been stopped, but it wasn't. So let's have great sympathy for them, and let's just hope that the Church of England and anybody involved who can help end as far as possible their suffering acts now and does not let it go on any longer. Bless you, and I look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Bless you. Continue to be the wonderful person you are, and continue to show love and compassion to all those you meet and all those